Carys is a public policy analyst and researcher for Christian Concern in the UK, and her expertise is in the interrelationship between Christian theology and ethics and government policy and legislation. She works on the case for free speech and religious freedom over against conversion therapy bans and gender ideology laws in the UK and internationally. She's on the Research Executive Board also of the IFTCC. Very great honor to have you, Carys. Thanks for being here.
So, as I'm a policy analyst and I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, what can I contribute? I would ask questions about the Coventry University research that the government commissioned and ask you to consider them with me. And I'm aiming this also at policy makers and MPs and people working with MPs and members of the House of Lords. And if you're thinking of talking or writing to those parliamentarians, this might be of interest to you as well. We've already heard a lot of the details, so some of this might sound like a bit of a recap. Okay? So first of all, what is conversion therapy and who decides what it is? And you can see what I'm going to do with these slides is on the left-hand side you'll have the Coventry University studies claim, and then I'm going to delve into the reality on the right. Okay? So, what the Coventry researchers say, conversion therapy is commonly used as an umbrella term to refer to attempts to modify someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. The word therapy may not accurately reflect the nature of conversion efforts, which may take the form of religious practices rather than using therapeutic approaches. Well, this doesn't tell us very much, because as I think many are familiar by now, the term has a history. The term was coined by an American psychology researcher, Douglas Haldeman, in 1991. Now, it's the history of the research that he uses to do that, which is important. His category, conversion therapy, conflated reports of adult male clients who are going of their own accord, their own volition, freely to see a therapist in the USA. It was actually Irving Bieber in New York City. A lot of them had been abused as children or had poor experiences, and they wanted out. And a lot of them had quite a positive experience of therapy. And he conflated and put in the same category studies of homosexual sex offenders in the UK, which was done by the Home Office. And that actually, the study that included that also was problematic. It was a British paper, again conflating different kinds of study in the same way. That's just very poor research practice, I think you would agree. You don't have to be a psychologist researcher to see that. And when you looked in the UK study on offenders, and this is before 1967, before the decriminalisation of same-sex behaviour for men over the age of consent, obviously not all of them had an intrinsic motivation to be there. Some of them, it was required. It was part of a sex offender treatment program. Now that, of course, may sound bizarre and offensive today, but remember that we still have sex offender treatment programs for all kinds of offenders. They've been in the news, they've been controversial, how well they work, but it's something that goes back decades. It's not exclusively tied to same-sex offences. 17% of these UK, we'll call them clients, but they were, offenders or prisoners, would still be classed as sex offenders today because they were offending against minors. So that's important, okay? And these are completely different kinds of people, different motives. I can't be having them all conflated. So the category conversion therapy is a corrupted category. Number two, where does same-sex attraction come from? There's a total lack of curiosity about this in the Coventry study claim, and yet in the culture, I think people are asking these questions. Just because it's not talked about in the mainstream press doesn't mean it's not of interest to people personally, as we've seen. So yes, this lack of curiosity about the sources and origins is problematic. We just have this statement. Today, same-sex sexual orientations and transgender identities are considered a normal part of human variation. Well, can you have normal and variation in the same sentence? I won't try and answer that. And are not included as mental disorders within the latest edition of the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases. That just talks about the consensus, what one of the speakers called a coercive consensus. That's all that is a summing up. But if you go back, maybe the last 2 or 3 decades, there used to be this talk about the gay gene and the hunt for it among some scientists. It was only really looking at men, and when it was getting into the press, certainly. It wasn't looking at a lesbian gene. So why is that difference? And also, I think it's impossible to ignore the fact that same-sex sexual orientation and attraction is more common in countries with birth rates below the replacement level. I've never seen a study on this, okay? There's nobody who's actually done a study, you know, random ensemble, but it's quite striking, I think. And so I think a genetic cause is also probably implausible for that reason, and then that changes a lot of things, and policymakers should be questioning what's going on here. Number 3, is transgender identity natural or pathological? Follows on from my last slide. Okay, so the reality, again, there's never really been a hunt for a transgender gene, funny that, and hence no warrant for a claim of normal variation, as in our nature, in our human nature. The scientific literature, others have been able to speak to some of that, higher psychiatric comorbidities. Transgender identification is most common, again, in countries with birth rates below replacement level, okay? And the same countries have very liberal laws privileging LGBT identities. Some of them probably function as incentives for people to come out and experiment. Number 4, perhaps more personally, why do people seek out therapy or pastoral care? I think it's very striking with the Coventry study when they list the common reasons, and I'm quoting everything on the left, by the way, are direct quotes, okay? A perceived incompatibility between someone's religious values and their sexual orientation or gender identity. A desire to belong and feel normal within a community. How intrinsic is that motivation? It's really an external motivation. External pressure or coercion by somebody's family members or people from their faith community. Peter mentioned Michael King. Michael King's study of British mental health professionals in the early years of this millennium actually showed that I think it was only 7% of the clients that were remembered by this random sample of professionals, quite a large sample in the UK, had family pressure as the main reason for coming. Okay, so it's not really plausible for the UK. Some people report that while they underwent conversion therapy voluntarily, they feel these choices were shaped by powerful influences in their social environment and under guidance from authority figures. So the impression the Coventry researchers gave you is that it's all really external motivation. But the reality is that they'd never asked clearly about intrinsic positive motivations. There can be many, but for example, we should be and could be asking about belief that God created human beings, male and female, and for marriage between one man and one woman only. Feeling that same-sex behavior and feelings is unnatural and violates the design and the form of the human body. That is actually a motivator. It's just not talked about. There's kind of a stigma about even asking about that. Not wanting to live at odds with one's biological sex by going through with gender reassignment. So in this sense, the Coventry study shares the same flaw with the Faith and Sexuality Survey of the Ozanne Foundation in 2018, which is cited as so-called grey literature by the researchers. Because they're not interested in the positive, life-giving motivations. Oh, that just won't do. How can you form such a policy on ignoring motivation? Then, looking a bit sideways, when did clients start seeking help? And this is a question I've got about history. They say, the Coventry researchers say, that conversion therapy was originally conceived in the early to mid-20th century at a time when homosexuality and transsexualism were considered mental disorders. They were administered by mental health professionals, sometimes by court order. They're referring to criminal courts, like I mentioned earlier. And they include some of these physical treatments from psychiatry, not therapy, not psychotherapy. The reality is more subtle. I've been looking at the archives of mental health associations, looking at how people were seeking help and how it was offered to them. Talking therapy has been available in the UK, at least in the London area, for the last 100 years. The Wolfenden Committee on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution, convened by the Home Office in the 1950s, therapists turned up to that to give evidence about their clients. Okay, all the major mental health professional bodies, most of the ones, not all, but many of the ones that exist today were in existence then, gave evidence. The Coventry study, therefore, distorts the history of treatments. They ignore Wolfenden completely. There was no overarching concept of conversion therapy at that time. The word doesn't exist. And I mentioned the offences already. So talking therapy and not physical treatments was the norm. That was one of the big differences between the UK and Germany. Have I gone through that one? Yeah. So why is there inconsistency about research methods? Obviously, we've heard a lot more detail, so this is not going to be a very long point. The Coventry researchers claim, they complain there's no randomized controlled trials that are being conducted in relation to the effectiveness or harmfulness of conversion therapy. The studies included in the rapid evidence assessment, therefore, fall short of the gold standard in clinical evidence for assessing effectiveness. Okay, that's what they say about the research they've looked at. And then they say it should be noted that it would be practically and ethically difficult to conduct randomized controlled trials on forms of conversion therapy. It's therefore unlikely that there will ever be gold standard evidence upon which to base policy, and this report is based on the best available evidence. Oh dear. They don't seem to want high-quality research in the field, because they don't like the idea that other people might be unhappy. And here's a quote from Adam Jowett, the lead researcher. He's the president or the head of the Psychology of Sexuality section of the British Psychological Society, so he's got a lot of influence. So he wrote an article all about these issues in The Conversation, or about sexuality in general, I should say, in 2014. And there's a long comment section where people could respond and interact, and he interacted with his readers. And he said at that point, homosexuality shouldn't be treated because it is not a mental disorder, okay, but not everything, as therapists will tell you, not everything that people go to help for, get help for, is classified as a mental disorder, okay? So we should not choose, this is what he's saying, I don't know who we is, but we should not choose to be straight because there is nothing immoral and loving about loving someone of the same gender. And the basis of sexual orientation is irrelevant because we are humans and deserve human rights. So the basis of where sexual orientation comes from is irrelevant. So we're not interested in questions of truth and origins. And we should not choose to be straight. Now that's, to me, the most fascinating, the most significant phrase in everything that is being said. This is the man who authored and who led the Coventry study. Who is we? We've heard about how non-LGBT people who have same-sex attraction or gender confusion are not included in the studies, okay? And so who is we, and why is legislation, therefore, being proposed to criminalize the help for those who don't fit into the we, the royal we? Why was so much relevant research ignored? I know we've heard the details, okay, but let's just look at this paragraph here where they explain themselves. The rapid review was conducted to review evidence published from January 2000 to June 2020. That sounds pretty up to date, but... And then it says based on rapid evidence assessment methods and the rapid evidence assessment guidance produced by this Centre for the Civil Service in the UK. Okay? And of course they mentioned the Jones and Yahoo study that some are already familiar with Christians in the US moving away from homosexual behaviour. So they mentioned it but don't want to engage it. The reality is that they also tell us what they excluded from their own literature review, this rapid research. The narrative and systemic literature, books and extracts from books, not very good because you're reading a book, you get a more, perhaps more interaction between some of the statistical work and some of the narratives and the worldview and so on. Studies not published in English, studies published prior to 2000. Like I said, there's over 100 years of people looking into this. Studies that did not provide data that would help answer the research questions. Well, they didn't want to know about intrinsic and positive motivations. So a call for evidence was sent, and this is really important. Who are they talking to? Who did the Coventry researchers ask for help? Because they did have a short period of time, to be fair. They went and used 2 email lists for psychologists, specializing in sexual orientation, gender identity, or LGBT issues. One UK-based and one international. Now, that seems reasonable. They don't name the mailing lists, which is not right, an email list for UK LGBT health researchers, and to representatives of a Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy Working Group. Now, this group keeps on changing its name. It was the Coalition Against Conversion Therapy, and now it's the MOU group, and so on. It's very secretive. It doesn't have a web presence, but the people who are really behind it are the people from Pink Therapy. And Pink Therapy are the group. They were there from the beginning pushing the memorandum. It's probably a foregone conclusion that gender identity is included in the conversion therapy ban in Britain because of them. Okay? So the gender critical movement thinks that you can split off therapy for gender identity from therapy for same-sex attraction. You can't because it's Pink Therapy that's running it. And their template is queer theory. They were the people who really normalized gay affirmative therapy in the UK from the 1990s onwards. And they're also into normalizing things like polyamory and sadomasochism and promiscuity. So there we go. They don't like me looking them up. They blocked me on Facebook, and I found other ways of looking at what they say. So there we go. They're not deterred by that. Number 8, not long to go. So where's the comparison with similar research? Okay, so most evidence-based recommendations say the Coventry researchers for working therapeutically with LGBT people in distress endorse psychological approaches that provide unconditional acceptance, identity exploration, and social support to help them work through difficult emotions. It's not clear what they mean by unconditional acceptance there. I think it means unconditional acceptance of the feelings and orientation, which is not the same as unconditional acceptance of a person. But the reality is, I would suggest that there is a little-known study by Michael King from 2007 that he co-wrote with colleagues for the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. And I think that that is comparable because it was used to influence the policy of the mental health professional bodies. Now, I apologise in advance, I don't have it up on my slide. I wanted the slide to be neat, but I will put it in this bank that we've got for people who've attended today to look at. But I'll just tell you the title. It's called A Systematic Review of Research on Counselling and Psychotherapy for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender People. I'll come back to that in a minute. The Coventry research was oriented towards sidelining or banning conversion therapy, but so really, in a way, more subtle way, was this 2007 study. The 2007 study was again a meta-study of the available evidence on affirmative therapies and promoting therapies not just for this client niche of people who wanted to live out, gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender life identity, but for all of training. So I'm going to do a tiny number of quotes from the end from the recommendations. And I regret that this study is not more widely known because it really has shaped the climate that led to all of these policies. So first of all, they did not find random, this business of gold standard research based on random samples, they did not find that with LGBT affirmative therapy back then. There was little consistent use of standardized measures of outcome. Therapists were mostly highly rated in terms of general satisfaction and perceived helpfulness. Well, that's different from actually helping. Most quantitative studies involve convenient samples of LGBT people, which means the selection bias is likely. The generalizability of existing results to all LGBT people undergoing therapy is questionable. Now, that's a massive finding, okay? But they wanted LGBT affirmative therapists. And they admitted that the research wasn't quite up to scratch, but nevertheless, they made policy recommendations, okay? And so they said, we would recommend that all psychotherapy training institutes regard knowledge of LGBT development and lifestyle as part of core training, despite not having good enough evidence. What does this actually mean? Heteronormative bias must be recognized and avoided. So queer theory was being made the basis for all of mental health care and all of mental health care training back in 2007. Therapists should increase their knowledge of these issues, and so on. Psychotherapeutic practice that pathologizes homosexuality, bisexuality, and transgenderism should be replaced by more modern understandings of sexual identity. More modern, okay? So we're not looking at evidence, it's an idea, a set of ideas that supersedes the others. And again, ignoring this non-LGBT client base. So that was Michael King in 2007. And that's the comparable study. Number 9, quickly, do undercover journalism reports count as evidence? Why am I suddenly throwing that in? That's because the Coventry researchers put it in their section of what they call grey literature. Grey literature not captured in the rapid evidence assessment may provide important sources of evidence, and they include undercover journalist investigations. Paul Brand, Patrick Strudwick, for example. I think everybody in the room is familiar with those. So here's the problem, and I think this is a big issue for the consultation now in England and Wales. Conversion therapy survivor testimonies have been invented by undercover journalists. Am I over-egging the pudding by saying invented? I don't think so. They haven't, mostly, with one exception, they haven't actually released complete recordings to back up the written text in newspapers. These testimonies are the only verifiable evidence, as in having recording to prove what was said. By a therapist or a pastor in the UK. And if you start off by lying and deceiving, and deceiving the therapist, why should you and your campaign expect to be treated seriously? These journalists were offended by words used by therapists or religious leaders because they didn't have the same worldview as the non-LGBT clients or participants in ministries. And so effectively, these journalists or campaigners want a ban based on a supposed right not to be offended. But the Coventry researchers haven't delved into the ethical problem. And finally, credentials. So the Coventry researchers gave their names at the end of the study, and it's published on the government website. They don't give their credentials. They are professional psychologists. But when you look at the Coventry University pages, they've got no research or practical experience prior to this study in this field of change-allowing therapies. Why? Well, I don't want to be too hard on them. The truth is there's no such research expertise in the UK, and I think the reason is the climate created above all by Michael King and by pink therapy over the last 14 years. So, the take-home point is good research is open-ended and curious. Propaganda-led research is closed-minded.